Everybody. It's right here. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I think we can get started. I hope you've all had a wonderful time so far. Certainly just been a pleasure for us to be back together with all of you. So thank you so much for being here. Before we move on to our next presentation, I just wanted to say thank you to Ballet Sun Valley, the Sun Valley Music Festival, and the Sun Valley Company, who have worked so hard with us these last many months to try to figure out how we could all be together. It turns out that our restrictions, if you will, are a little bit more stringent than the other organizations, and that's because we are fully together for 2 days, eating meals together and just spending enough time that our consultants felt that the best thing to do would be to require vaccination cards from each of you. My hat is off to you, and we salute you because everyone sent us their vax cards, which has just been wonderful. So we are able to say that we are in a very, very safe and healthy environment. Our visitors on the lawns, you know, they're not wearing badges, so we assume everybody's good out there, but as long as you are here, you are under very good conditions. We worked with an organization called Nine Foundations, which is affiliated with the Harvard School of Public Health, and they flew their representatives out here, checked out the pavilion top to bottom, you know, worked with the staff that has to work behind the scenes where they can't be outside and they're in these rooms. They checked out the whole campus, and they came back with the recommendation of how we're doing this. So it's been great. Also in the audience here is Dr. Jack Stapleton. He is an infectious disease specialist, and he runs, yes, and there he is, right. You want to stand up, Jack? Thank you. Runs a virus lab in Iowa City. And he has kindly agreed to hold a little Q&A session at lunchtime tomorrow. I think will be from 12:45 to 1:15. So if you have any questions, you hear what's happening out there in the world, we're kind of in our own protective bubble, but Jack will be more than happy to talk to you about that. Now, because the break after this talk is so short, we've asked Daniel James Brown and Tom IKEDA to sign books at 6:30 in the book signing tent. So they will do that after the last talk of the evening. Now, please welcome an original founder of the Sun Valley Writers Conference. We go back many, many years together. A wonderful friend and the former head of the community school, John Maxick, who will do the introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, and also welcome. Like many Americans, I've long had a general understanding of the shameful chapter in American history recounted by Daniel James Brown in his book, Facing the Mountain. But sometimes a general understanding is no more than a comfortable expedient. After Pearl Harbor, the United States government incarcerated more than 120,000 Japanese Americans and people of Japanese descent, 2/3 of whom were American citizens. Their families were ruptured and humiliated, their homes and businesses stolen and destroyed. In an excess of bureaucratic euphemism, all of them, including American citizens, were called enemy aliens. Their forced removals were called evacuations. And concentration camps where they were confined were called relocation centers. Facing the Mountain reveals the layers of social and familial complexity and conflict that characterize this saga of betrayal, racism, and heroism. And the family stories, intimate and immediate, told by the fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who endured them, are heartrending. At the center of the book is the story of the 442nd United States Army Regiment, the most decorated regiment in U.S. military history, and comprised nearly entirely of Japanese Americans who were finally allowed, after 2 years, to enlist in the war effort, and were repeatedly asked to fight the most brutal of battles while their parents declined in grim barracks, hoping their sons would return. Many did not. The 442nd lost more than 800 men, killed or missing in action, a horrendous casualty rate. The regiment was awarded 21 Congressional Medals of Honor, more than 4,000 Purple Hearts, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, and more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, as well as 7 Presidential Unit citations. All in the face of grotesque bigotry at home that was not that dissimilar from the bigotry against which they fought with such valor. If facing the mountain reminds us of our worst qualities as a nation, it reminds us as well of what is possible when we are at our best and most honorable. And it underscores that patriotic cant is no substitute for genuine patriotism. A book for our times is a tired book marketing cliche that regularly finds its way into blurbs and onto book covers. But given the vitriol and hate that has been spewed across the American landscape during the past 6 years, I propose that Facing the Mountain is indeed a book for our times. Please welcome to the Sun Valley Writers Conference Daniel James Brown, the author of Facing the Mountain, The Boys in the Boat, not yet, The Indifferent Stars Above, Under a Flaming Sky, and welcome also Tom Ikeda, the executive director of Densho, an organization dedicated to the preservation of the history of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. Now, welcome them. Thank you.
John, thank you. That was wonderful. Dan, I just want to take a moment. This is our first live event. We've been doing Zoom events. It's just great to see a live audience. Thank you all. Nice to see everyone. And John, thank you for that introduction. That by far is the best introduction we've had to the book. We've done about 6 or 7 Zoom events together, and that was by far the best one. It gave a wonderful historical perspective.
Absolutely.
Dan and I are both into stories, so I thought we would start with a story about how the two of us met. We were on stage like this in Seattle, both receiving a mayor's award. This was 5.5 years ago, and Dan was there to receive an award for The Boys in the Boat, which I'm guessing, just a show of hands, how many people have read The Boys in the Boat? Yeah, so Dan, look at this, everyone here. And so, from my perspective, one of the best examples or best books of nonfiction that I've ever read. And so I had read the book. I knew I was going to be on the stage with Dan, and so I was really excited to meet with him. I was there as the executive director of Densho. So we're known, especially in the Japanese American community, as the story keepers. We for the last, we'll get emotional about this, for the last 25 years have been collecting the raw personal stories of the men and women affected that John was talking about in the introduction. And so we're on the stage. The mayor's about ready to give the presentation, and Dan and I are talking, and I tell Dan how much I really enjoyed this book, the history, the storytelling. And at that point, you said something that surprised me. You said that you were interested in Japanese American history. And I remember I came away from that thinking, oh my gosh, you're genuinely interested. Can you share what you were thinking at that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I have always had an interest in Japanese American experience for a variety of personal reasons. But it was really sitting there listening to you when you started talking about how you've been collecting these firsthand accounts, mostly of Nisei second-generation Japanese Americans and their experience during World War II, that it really, I was really intrigued by what you had been doing. So I went home that night and I sat down, and all these, Tom has been collecting and videotaping these oral histories of Japanese Americans for 25 years now. And there are hundreds of them that he has collected, curated, and put up on the Densho website. So after hearing you talk about your work, I went home and I started watching these oral histories, mostly of what were then older men and women talking about when they were younger men and women. And I'm a person that's all about story. Story is what really gets me going. And I was just mesmerized by many of the stories I was hearing. There were stories that brought me to tears. There were stories that made me laugh. There were stories that inspired me. And so within a day or two of watching many of these oral histories, I decided I really wanted to try to capture some of these stories. And then I began to work with you, Tom, to sort of figure out how to go about doing that.
And I remember those early days when we would go back and forth, and you would and so to give some context. So I've been doing this for 25 years. So literally, I've talked with hundreds of authors, filmmakers, podcasters, educators who want to create products from the stories, and so they often come to Densho to hear the stories. My experience with you was a little different in that generally when people come to me and I tell them about the story, I'll share like you should look at this interview or that interview or check out this photograph. And I initially did that with you, and you then came back not only having seen those interviews, but looked a lot more and came back with more interesting questions for me. And so it began this really, I think, deep and personal and fun experience for me, because I really felt we became colleagues in here. It was a real interesting experience. And you even brought your wife in here, Sharon's here, because I remember you even went to Hawaii to do some research. You were in the libraries, you were getting letters from a couple of chaplains from the 442, information I didn't know about, and I remember sitting down with both of you and sharing that. So that was really, really important. So, but it was interesting though, and this was the next experience. When I work with people this deeply, after several months or so, they get bogged down because the story can be so complex. American citizens being placed in camps, going to war, others resisting, the women's stories. There's so much there. And I remember thinking, okay, so this is where it's going to get really interesting. This is going to be hard. And I'm wondering, so how did you narrow the story down?
Yeah, that was the big challenge. I didn't want to write a comprehensive history of Japanese Americans. For one thing, that'd be really presumptuous of somebody like me. And it's not what I do. What I try to do is I try to find personal stories that shed light on some slice of history and introduce my readers to those personalities, to those individual characters, so that they can see how the history has shaped their lives. That's what happened with the boys in the boat, and that's what I tried to do in this book. But it was a problem. It was, there were so many good stories and so much history and so much complexity that actually what I wound up doing was I decided to focus on a particular dilemma, or the dilemma that a particular group of Japanese Americans faced. And that was young Japanese American men of draft age, Nisei men of draft age. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, they were faced with a series of really terrible dilemmas. And it was hard for them to know how to navigate the terrain ahead of them. Their families, and in some cases themselves, were being incarcerated in these camps through the American West. Many of them wanted to, like millions of other young American men, they wanted to sign up for the military after Pearl Harbor and do something to serve their country. But when they tried to do that, they were told that they were enemy aliens and they couldn't serve. And so they had really difficult decisions to make about where their loyalties lay and how they were going to deal with this dilemma that they face. So I wound up narrowing it down and focusing on 4 young men in particular and their families. The families are very important here, and weaving their stories together to try to shed quite a bit of light on the larger story.
Yeah, I remember that process going down to 4 because I think of your experience with the boys in the boat. You had the Joe Rance character, and I remember you coming to me and says, "Well, is there one person, one family that can capture it. And we went back and forth and realized we really couldn't.
Yeah.
And I was, I think, at that point suggesting, well, maybe it's a compilation of about 12 families. And you said, well, from a story standpoint, that would be too complicated. So you did get down to 4.
Right.
And I thought what would be interesting for the audience is to actually go into each one of them, but do it from a primary source perspective. And so we're going to start with the first one, Gordon Hirabayashi. And here's a photograph of Gordon and his bride, Esther Schmo, when they were married in Spokane. This was during World War II, and there was a time between some of his trials and actually going to prison. But tell me about Gordon and why you chose to have Gordon in this.
Gordon Hirabayashi is such an interesting character. He was a student at the University of Washington when Pearl Harbor happened. He was a kind of quirky young man. He was a Quaker. He was a man of very strong principles, and he believed in living his life according to these principles, regardless of consequences. So one of the first things that happened in Seattle to Japanese Americans, to anybody of Japanese ancestry, was that a curfew was imposed. So Japanese Americans were not allowed to be out on the streets after 8 p.m. And Gordon, quite early on, decided that he was going to violate that curfew, that it didn't accord with his understanding of the American Constitution. And then a little later, when the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to get on buses and be taken away to these assemblies, what they were called assembly centers, and ultimately to these camps, Gordon just didn't get on the bus. Instead, he stayed behind. He became the last Japanese American in Seattle. He sat down and he wrote a statement outlining why he thought that the curfew and the incarcerations in these camps were wrong and illegal and, in his view, unconstitutional. A very carefully reasoned statement. And he went downtown Seattle and he walked into the FBI offices there and he handed them this statement and turned himself in. And the FBI agents were completely flummoxed by this guy. They did not know what to do with him. And Gordon had this very implacable manner where if you asked him a question, he would just ask you a question in response. So they spent a day driving Gordon around Seattle, trying to get him, taking him to different places, trying to get him to sign a registration form that would allow them to incarcerate him. And he refused to do that. So that night they took him to the King County Jail in Seattle and locked him up. And that, for the remainder of the war years, he was in and out of jail and prison fighting a legal battle that eventually worked its way up to the Supreme Court. Extraordinary young man, a very interesting young man.
And you all know, about Dan's writing and the level of detail. And for Facing the Mountain, a lot of that detail came from the oral histories.
Yeah.
And Dan mentioned, so Densho has about now 1,000 of these in-depth oral histories. And I thought I'd show you a clip where Gordon's talking about being in the library at the University of Washington when he has sort of that aha moment that he's going to defy the government, the orders to obey the curfew. And so and this was a clip that, I'll just show it right now. Out there. Audio's off.
Oh, we have no audio here.
Can we get audio?
And then one day,
So actually,
I'm dashing home.
I mean, back
hey,
up.
Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I grab my stuff and it takes about 5 minutes to get home. So I'm just dashing home, and it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there? It just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, without saying, I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
Yeah, and with that, he took this extraordinary stand, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Right, and I think you have to understand that Gordon was a college student. He was in his early 20s here. And to take the stand that he took, he had to defy and come in conflict with one thing, his own family and large part of the Japanese American community that didn't think this was the right thing to do. But more fundamentally, with the entire force of the U.S. government. He had to stand up, and he continued to stand up through this whole rather tortuous legal crusade that he went on to all kinds of pressures. And it's a kind of courage, kind of ethical courage or moral courage that I think when you get to know him, when you read his story, you'll find really inspiring.
And so for Facing the Mountain, having Gordon in the book, it really shows that resistance factor of the Japanese American experience during World War II. Next we go to Katsugo Miho in Hawaii. Because a lot of people don't know the story of Japanese Americans in Hawaii. There were actually more Japanese Americans in Hawaii than there were on the mainland. And I think many of you know about the internment and incarceration of Japanese Americans, which was pretty much on the West Coast. But imagine you have more Japanese Americans in Hawaii where the attack at Pearl Harbor happened. So talk about Katz Miho and his role in the book.
Yeah, so Katz, another remarkable young man. Katz grew up on Maui at a time when Maui was basically one vast sugarcane plantation. And of course the plantation system was very racially stratified. The working conditions were brutal. It exploited particularly first-generation Japanese and Filipino and other immigrants who worked in the cane fields. Absolutely horrific working conditions. So he grew up in this plantation system, but by the time of Pearl Harbor, he was actually a student at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. And he witnessed the attack of Pearl Harbor from the roof of his residence hall. He saw the thing unfold. And then he was a member of the ROTC. So he and several hundred other young ROTC cadets, mostly Japanese Americans, rushed onto the campus and assembled in the armory there. And they were that afternoon turned into something called the Hawaii the Hawaii Territorial Guard. They were issued these old 1903 rifles, and they were told to go down that night and patrol the waterfront against what everybody expected would be an invasion by Japanese imperial forces. This was a big deal for Katz to find himself in uniform. He went down, he found himself patrolling the waterfront, and then that came abruptly to an end. And I think we're going to show you a clip of how that ended.
Yeah, so this is a clip where Katz talks about being in the Hawaii Territorial Guard. This video comes from the University of Hawaii and their Center for Oral Histories. So here's Katz.
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over area in the dark on 4-hour shifts. And for 2-3 nights in a row, we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done, because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told, you load it this way, this is the way how you lock it, in case anything happens. To this day, I wonder, what was if anything happened was what they were referring to. Not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened, what were we supposed to do? Because we were not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, Early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. And we woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We were all fully packed and everything. They dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the acting commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right straight in our face, he says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans or Japanese, I'm pretty sure he referred to it, Americans of Japanese ancestry, because of your ethnic background, you are being discharged herein right off the bat, right as of now you are being discharged from the Hawaiian territory. Only the AJAs. And completely still a shock.
Yeah, I really like that clip. I mean, early on, he talks about essentially the absurdity of defending the islands with this, World War I era, and so they're risking their lives. And then at the end, where the rifles are then taken away from them.
And I mean, imagine the shock. These guys, they find themselves on an athletic playing field in Honolulu in the pre-dawn darkness, and have no idea why they're there. And then they're suddenly told, well, you're no longer welcome to serve. We're taking your uniform and your rifle away from you. Katz mentioned, a number of the guys that were there that morning, that they could hear other young men in the darkness around them crying. They were so upset at what had happened. So Katz went back to Maui. His family ran a little family hotel there, and he got a job as a contractor working on one of the military bases that were being built in Hawaii at the time. But he wasn't actually allowed to enlist or to serve until a year later.
And the other role that I think Katz played in his family is the role of women in your book too. I mean, you focused on 4 men as kind of the key players, but the story of women, I think, really comes out well in Katz's story.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that although the book is is focused on these 4 young men, it's very much in the context of their families and how all these events affected their families. But yeah, Katz had a sister who was a very interesting young woman. Her name was Fumie Miho. Fumie moved to Japan. She was fed up with the racial situation in Hawaii, and so she moved to Japan a couple years before the war broke out, and then she was essentially trapped in Japan as an American citizen once the war began. And she quickly began to realize how hard life was in Japan as the situation in that country deteriorated. So her perspective is really interesting as the rest of the story is unfolding. She's living in Japan, and then we see her at the end of the book in 1945. She lived with a sister who had stayed in Japan when the family immigrated, and the sister's husband. She and her in-laws, to escape the firebombing of Tokyo, moved to a village just outside of Hiroshima. And so the morning of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Fumie actually missed her train. Her job was in the city center of Hiroshima. She missed her train that morning. So she was still at the railroad station when the bomb was dropped. And of course she saw the mushroom cloud and witnessed it at quite a close distance. The next day, as trainloads full of horribly wounded and burned people were coming out of the city, Fumie worked her way into the city trying to find a work colleague, and of course she didn't. The center of Hiroshima no longer existed. But she spent days wandering around in the ruins of Hiroshima, trying to give water and to give aid to some of these grievously wounded people. She later became a Quaker and a peace activist and spent the rest of her life traveling around the world advocating for peace.
Yeah, great story. So the third one, and we're now going more to the the story of Japanese Americans who were placed in these American concentration camps and actually volunteered out of the army. This is a photograph of Rudy Tokiwa. He's up in front. And it's an image that was taken by the War Department after he had captured a group of German soldiers while he was serving in Europe. But Dan, tell me about Rudy. I mean, we both love this character because I interviewed Rudy, and he's somewhat of the rascal.
Rudy was very much a rascal. Rudy's army name was Punch Drunk. He tended not to follow army rules real closely and got in all kinds of trouble. But he had an absolutely huge heart. Rudy grew up on a farm near Salinas, California, and after Pearl Harbor, the FBI raided his house, and he and his family were incarcerated first at the Salinas Rodeo grounds, and then were taken to Poston, one of these 10 concentration camps around the country, particularly bleak, hot place, Poston. And so he found himself living in this camp at Poston when in early 1943 the Army reversed its earlier decision and decided it would allow Japanese Americans to serve in the U.S. Army in a special segregated unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. That announcement, though, set off a huge amount of debate among the young men within the camp. Many of them were very resistant to the idea of serving in the military so long as they and their families were being incarcerated in these camps. Other of these young men felt that, by enlisting and fighting and bleeding and in some cases dying, perhaps this was, in a sense, an opportunity to prove the loyalty of Japanese Americans. So it set off a fierce debate. Rudy was one of those who opted to enlist in the 442nd and to serve in Europe.
Right, and during John's introduction, he talked a little bit about how recognized they were in terms of the awards. Let's go to Europe and talk a little bit about the fighting. In particular, there's a part in your book where you highlight. It's called the Rescue Lost Battalion. It's this 1 month in October that included a liberation of a couple of French towns also. Yeah, so
at this point, the 442nd, this all-Japanese American fighting unit, had been in Europe for a year. They had fought their way up the Italian boot from one village to another, had taken extraordinary casualties, but also had displayed incredible valor in the various battles they fought in. In the fall of 1944, they were shipped to the French-German border to the Vosges forest, and they were given the task of liberating a town called Bruyères, which was the intersection of a couple of highways and a railroad line. At this point, it was cold and foggy and rainy and muddy and miserable in that part of Europe. The 442nd fought for days to liberate Bruyères, again took very heavy casualties, but did ultimately liberate that village, and then pushed deeper into the Vosges forest and liberated a village called Belmont and another village called Bifontaine. And then at that point, they were finally, after days of combat, given leave to take a night or two to find a barn or a shed or something, someplace to get a little sleep and rest a little bit. But on the second night, they were suddenly awakened in the middle of the night and told to put their combat gear back on, that they were going back into battle. And what had happened was the commanding general, General Dahlquist, had ordered several hundred of a Texas battalion, 141st Infantry. He had ordered them deeper into the Vosges forest than he should have. And they had become trapped out on the end of a ridgeline up on this mountain, surrounded by German troops. Many of them were wounded. They had run out of medical supplies, run out of food, had no drinkable water. They began to die. Dahlquist became increasingly desperate. He sent a number of other members of the 141st, other Texas units up to try to get these guys out. Nobody could break through. So finally he turned to the all-Japanese American 442nd and woke these guys up in the middle of the night and sent them up that mountain. And they fought their way up that mountain for the next several days against absolutely devastating firepower. Pretty much everywhere the 442nd fought, they were fighting their way uphill. The Nazis, the Germans, almost always held the high ground. So they were firing the machine guns and tank rounds downhill into these troops that were trying to come up the hill. Took terrible casualties, but they did finally break through to these trapped Texans. They were called the Lost Battalion at that point, and got them back down off the mountain. But they were not themselves then brought back down off the mountain. They were ordered to fight on themselves deeper into the Vosges. For another 5 days, I think, they kept fighting. By the end of all that, Rudy was a member of K Company, which was one of the lead companies going up the mountain. I believe at the beginning of the battle for Gruyere, the K Company had had something like 180 fighting men. By the time they finally came down back off of that mountain, there were only 17 of them who were still able to walk. So absolutely extraordinary casualty rate.
Yes, I'm going to show a clip of Rudy talking about in the aftermath of all that fighting. General Dahlquist, who Dan mentioned, was that commanding general who had ordered that Texan unit too far ahead. He wanted to do what was called a retreat parade, where he would stand on a platform and have the 442nd sort of parade by him so he could acknowledge them. The 442nd at full strength is about 4,000 men, and Dan was talking about the casualties in K Company, but it was across the board that on that day there were less than 1,000 men, about 700 to 800 men left standing because they're either being killed, wounded, sick, just unable. And so here Rudy talks about the general's reaction when he sees the 442nd.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review, and like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters, and they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I ordered everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
It's always hard for me to see this clip. When I interviewed Rudy and he talked about this, after this point, he would continue, tearing up about the loss and how ironic it was that his family and other families were back in the United States in these concentration camps, and yet they were being pushed so hard and in some ways not recognized for what they had done.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these guys came back feeling that they had been treated as cannon fodder pretty much throughout the war, but particularly in that one battle. But yeah, Rudy tears up there at the end of that, and as that interview went on, he teared up even more. When I saw it, I teared up. When Sharon saw it, she teared up. Rudy just had this huge heart, and although he was a very, very tough guy, he was very open in some ways about his emotions, and so I knew almost immediately after seeing his oral history that he was one of the guys I wanted to focus on.
Yeah, and just something as you were talking, I haven't talked about this before, but I had a conversation with General Rick Shinseki, a 4-star general. He was the Army Chief of Staff, and he told me that at the Pentagon there's actually a painting that depicts the Rescue Lost Battalion, and it was something that he really prized that it was in the Pentagon because it in his way said it honored the men and what they did. But moving on, the fourth person, we come back to the mainland. Fred Shiosaki, born and raised in the Spokane area, so just a few hours from here. And Fred's story is different. So there were Japanese Americans in Idaho, Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, and they weren't placed in camps. It was just this military exclusion zone, Western Washington, Western Oregon, California, parts of Arizona. And so Fred's experience was different. Talk about Fred.
Yeah, so Fred grew up in a neighborhood in Spokane called Hilliard, which was down by the railroad tracks, and it was a pretty tough neighborhood. It was a neighborhood with a lot of immigrant kids, and I think because of that, there were a lot of racial slurs that got tossed around. I mean, Fred was in many ways a very gentle man, and I think a man who was disinclined to fight, but he would not abide racial slurs thrown his direction, and so he was often getting in scuffles or fistfights. In fact, his family ran a laundry in Hilliard, and he was always coming home to his father with his glasses broken, and his poor father had to keep buying him new pairs of glasses because his were always getting broken. But for Fred was one of these guys that, the moment right after Pearl Harbor happened, he went down to the Selective Service office in Spokane, walked in and said he wanted to enlist. And he was told by the clerk there, he said, well, you can't enlist, you're an enemy alien. And he was absolutely floored by that. He said, I can't be an enemy alien, I'm an American. And he said, well, the clerk said, well, it doesn't matter, you're an enemy alien. And, it was just one of those things that Fred really had a hard time getting his head around. He spent the next year going to school at Gonzaga University in Spokane, but he was one of a very few males who were on the campus. There were almost only co-eds, females on campus at that point, or men in uniform being trained. And so it was humiliating for him that he couldn't, like all his friends from Rogers High in Spokane, he couldn't enlist. So when the 442nd was finally created, he did immediately enlist. He was one of those in K Company. He was one of those 17 who managed to come back down off the mountain. Well, we have a clip we're going to show about how that affected him.
Right, and for me, when I read the book, through Fred's eyes or through his character, you really saw what it was to be, kind of in the trenches as a soldier. I mean, some of the most powerful, vivid scenes, I think, came through Fred's eyes. And he was also very vulnerable, talking about, his insecurities being on the line. This clip, we talked about the Rescue Lost Battalion, and after the war, Fred's returning to Spokane, and he's now on a train to return to Spokane to go across the country. But he has a stop in Washington, D.C., where he meets a soldier from the Lost Battalion. So here's this clip.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington, D.C. And I was, actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure that must have been the Union Station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI came out, I think he's a buck sergeant, and he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my patch. He says, "Hey, you were the 442nd?" Yeah. He says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, "You know, if you guys are in there, we'd have come after you." And I shook my head and I said, "Well," he said, "Anyway, I want to thank you." He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, Fred, talks about that, in an interview, and how, in some ways he felt he was just being almost like I can't remember the term, almost insane or something, because it was so out of his character to do what he did. But the pain of losing so many friends, he said he was ashamed. He felt that he wished he could have shaken that hand, but he just couldn't at that point.
Yeah, I mean, afraid like all these guys and millions of American GIs, they came home with not just physical wounds, but with psychological wounds, and a lot of them suffered from PTSD. Fred moved back in to the apartment over the laundry in Spokane with his parents, and I know that for a year or so after that, his mother continually had to wake him up in the middle of the night because he was screaming in the night. So they came home with physical wounds, but also with mental wounds.
Yeah. And so the kind of the last question, Dan, so we have time for Q&A, was again back to the making of the book. We talked about how we met 5.5 years ago, and you started writing this book during a time when there's a lot of political and social upheaval in our country, and we were going back and forth, mostly on email, talking about what was going on in the country, and looking at what was happening and the similarities to what was happening, that would happen to Japanese Americans during World War II, and some of the things that were happening in our country. I mean, early on, we talked about some of the hateful rhetoric that was being used against Mexicans, as rapists and murderers, and how that was like a red flag for me, saying, it sounds similar to some of the rhetoric used against Japanese Americans during World War II. Later on, we talked about the Muslim travel ban and how the government was using national security to essentially ban travel from predominantly Muslim countries, and how that kind of smacked of the military necessity argument against Japanese Americans. And then the family detention and separation that was happening on the southern border, and how, especially with children, the conditions, and we know the trauma, and we talked about how that rhymed a lot with what happened to Japanese Americans. I was wondering how all that impacted you when you were writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, it was very noticeable as I began writing this book right at the beginning of the Trump administration, and through the process of writing it and doing my research, there were these echoes every day almost between what I was researching by day, and then I'm coming home and I'm watching the evening news, and there were all these echoes from the past in terms of the sort of rhetoric and the kinds of actions that administration was contemplating. So it didn't change, the content of what I was writing at all, but it certainly lent urgency to my feeling that this was a story that was really important to tell, and particularly in regards to language. When I was writing this book, I thought I knew a lot about the history of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence in this country. But as I did a deep dive into the research, I learned how extreme that was and how prevalent it was. So I spent a lot of time reading about anti-Chinese violence in the California in particular in the 19th century. There were lynchings and burnings and people being driven out of their homes. And then I was reading about this notion of the yellow peril that arose around the turn of the century in our media, in our newspapers, and a little later in Hollywood, where Asians were equated with locusts and rats and snakes and vermin and bringers of disease. And one of the echoes I was seeing was I realized how deeply embedded some of these racist tropes and images and phrases are in our American consciousness. When Pearl Harbor happened, all these images and slogans and phrases that were weaponized against them were already there in American culture, and they were just recycled and hurled against Americans of Japanese descent again. And then, even more troubling, in the last year or two especially, I've realized it's the same thing, the same tropes, the same images, the same associations have been weaponized again. They're still effective. They still have those roots, and they're being used again in a similar way. So it was very, it's enlightening to me, certainly, and I hope that as people read the book, it helps put some of what's happening now into a broader context.
No, I think that's one of the powers of the book. I think by your telling the story, but not necessarily hitting people over the head with, this is what you have to look at. I think it did come out. I want to end on a personal note for me. I'm Japanese American, third generation, and this is a very personal story for me. The photograph up here was taken about 80 miles from here. It's a photograph of my grandparents on the left receiving the U.S. flag for their eldest son who was killed in action. He was in the 100th Battalion, the 442nd. My grandparents, along with my parents, were in the Minidoka, Idaho camp, about an hour and a half drive here. And I was mentioning to Dan that, it's only 80 miles away. And I was also, just before this talk, in my room thinking how, ironic in some ways that here I'm in this incredibly posh place, resort, with, air conditioning, and how my grandparents and parents, were on this dusty field, triple-digit temperatures, sort of in this place, having to accept this flag. And, but with that, it's a hard story. It could be very depressing. But your book, and I want to end my part by just saying, in some ways, how uplifting by you telling the story. My 94-year-old dad, when he got a copy, read it in 3 days. I mean, he was just spellbound by the story. Obviously, he knew the story, but the way it was told was so powerful for him and other Japanese Americans who have read this. And it's been an uplifting experience for the community. It feels similar to when you did The Boys in the Boat. I know the rowing community really got behind it because of the authentic telling of what you did. And I'm starting to see the same thing with the Japanese American community as they did this. So I just wanted to thank you for the book, but also the personal relationship. I mean, for the last 5.5 years, we spent a lot of time together doing this, and it has been a real highlight for me. So thank you.
None of this would have happened without the work you've done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Good.
So are we ready for questions?
Yeah, so I think we're ready for some Q&A. And so are there any questions? And so we have some.
The 442nd was deployed in Europe, obviously, and I'm wondering if either of you in your research, like in the War Department records, found any discussion of whether that a unit would have been deployed in the Pacific, and were there any instances of Japanese Americans in, say, intelligence units or things like that, where there weren't a lot of Japanese prisoners taken during the Second World War, because there weren't, but where they might have been helpful for interrogating prisoners or intelligence or things like that.
Yeah, in fact, many of the recruits into the 442nd, if they had good Japanese language skills, which many of them did, many of them grown up in homes where Japanese was spoken, they were given a series of aptitude tests and so on and so forth. And if they passed this screening, had certain kinds of aptitude, and their Japanese language skills were sufficient, they were in fact siphoned off from the 442nd and steered into the Military Intelligence Service, which trained hundreds of MIS soldiers who were then deployed to the Pacific in a variety of roles. Many of them were behind the lines just listening in to communications, translating. But others actually were on the ground in the Philippines and Indochina and other places, interrogating prisoners. There's some actually incredibly heroic stories surrounding that. I would have loved to cover the 100th Infantry Battalion and the MIS, because there are these other branches of service that Japanese Americans performed for this country, but I had to sort of focus the book on a manageable amount of material. But yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stuff there.
It's incredibly, that whole story of the Pacific. General Willoughby, who was head of intelligence in the Pacific, stated that the MIS, the Japanese Americans who were interpreters and helped in that intelligence, shortened the war by 2 years. Because of their intelligence, the U.S. was able to advance in the Pacific much quicker because they essentially could read the battle plans of the Japanese on these various islands. And so they were so strategic. People don't know about them because they were so top secret. It wasn't until many, many decades later that the story of the MIS has come out. I'm sure there'll be books about that, and we have interviews. And this was one of our early discussions where we wanted to talk about that too, but it was just too much.
Yeah.
Wonderful presentation. A lot of talk right now in another context about reparations. Obviously, there was a long, concerted, and ultimately successful effort to get the United States government to apologize and to offer reparations. I think it was $20,000 a person in the 80s. I wonder if you could speak to how that was received by the Japanese American community, what that process meant and what we can learn from it.
I'm sure Tom can speak to this better than I can, but I did want to mention that a lot of the vets, the 442nd vets, were very instrumental in advancing the cause of getting those reparations. And Rudy Tokiwa was one of those who prowled the halls of Congress on crutches. Rudy came back with some severe injuries, and Rudy and some of his veteran comrades spent weeks prowling the halls of Congress, lobbying for redress.
Yeah, I was having this conversation with Helen Bing this morning, and she reminded me that Ronald Reagan in 1988 signed that the Civil Liberties Act. And in terms of how the Japanese American community responded to that, it gets to the issue of reconciliation. And one of the lessons, I think, from the World War II Japanese American incarceration is, we have... we know the history of our country. There's a lot of xenophobia in terms of fear of the other, and that was directed against Japanese Americans during World War II. We also have the Constitution, the rule of law, our court system to protect the vulnerable, but obviously that failed. And so one of the lessons is about reparations and reconciliation, and how important it is for the country, the government, to admit when it's wrong. In this case, it actually, I think, is an extraordinary thing that the U.S. government did look back at this, and with research, they had open hearings. It was a very powerful process for the community to actually be able to tell their story and for the government to hear, and then to go through the process, admit they were wrong, pass legislation, actually vacate previous Supreme Court decisions, and apologize to the Japanese American community. To some in the community, it wasn't enough. They wish there should have been more. But I think for most of it, the Japanese American community, it allowed Japanese Americans to move on. There was some healing from that. And so that's why I'm in support of a similar process of reconciliation and reparations for the African American community. I think we need, as a country, to do this, because by us just not looking at that and pushing it away, it's still going to fester. And if I told someone recently, if redress had not happened for the Japanese American community, I would probably, instead of telling the story and being sort of allies with other communities, I would probably be at the halls of Congress still fighting for an apology. So it allowed, I think, many in the community to move on. So it was very important.
Thank you. Wonderful book. Things are better for those that were in relocation camps. As an example, we have a friend as a little girl in her family were one of the camps. That little girl is now Doris Matsui, Congresswoman
yes,
from Sacramento. I do have a quick question. Dan, you mentioned very briefly in your book that Eleanor Roosevelt had some second thoughts about this whole process, particularly involving the older Japanese that had served in the military before the war, and Roosevelt just ignored her. President Roosevelt ignored her. Were there any others in his administration that had second thoughts as well?
I know there was quite a bit of debate within the Roosevelt administration before the Executive Order 9066 was issued. It wasn't, there was a vigorous debate, and I believe it was the State Department that argued against it, figures in the State Department. But ultimately, it was the military that argued, that was the base, that was the argument, military necessity, and ultimately Roosevelt listened to the voices of the military leaders.
Yeah, just one comment about that too. What attracted Eleanor Roosevelt's attention were these mothers who were writing letters from camp. So there was an active effort of getting the word out, defying the government, resisting, oftentimes from the women and mothers of the soldiers who were fighting. And so I think that really inspired Eleanor Roosevelt to actually go to one of the camps. Our time is up. Again, thank you so much for your attention. We really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you. That was good.